Right. Hello, everyone. We're going to give just a minute for everything to open up and get everybody in here from the waiting room, and we'll get started in just a few minutes.
Matt, I disabled the waiting room. That way they can just they can come in and you won't have to worry about it. And anyone that comes in, I will stop their video.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Christopher. All right. All right, you should be looking at a full screen of the first one. Does that look good and you can hear me and everything's good? Can't see chat, so I'm relying on you, Christopher.
Yes, it looks good.
Awesome. Okay. Pull up a little chat window here.
Everything looks good, Matt.
Awesome. Thank you guys very, very much.
Hey, it looks like we have some friends from our Tech Talk weekly webinars.
Oh, awesome.
If anyone doesn't know, every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do a webinar about technical topics, anything and everything. Our next one is going to be obviously tomorrow, Wednesday at 5 p.m. And it's going to be about shutter types, electronic shutter, mechanical shutter, electronic front curtain. And I'll drop a little link in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. That's going to be fun. I like all of the other sort of things that you can do with each of those as well. So, all right, it is 6:02 by my clock. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to start by thanking National Camera Exchange for having us here. The other gentleman that was just speaking is, if you're local to National Camera Exchange, it's your local technical rep. His name's Christopher Gilbert, and he is a powerhouse in his own right. But I was asked to, I'm another technical specialist for Fujifilm. My name's Matt Weintraub, as it says on the screen there. And I was asked to kind of come in and talk a little bit about macro. Speaking of macro, I was also informed that March is a macro feature month for National Camera Exchange. And so they actually have a bunch of macro products on sale. So if this presentation does what it's supposed to do and inspires you to get out there and take some photos, they have all of the gear necessary for you to do that. They're also running a photo contest. I think it's a black and white photo contest, but I think also we'll have Julie hop on from National Camera at the end of the presentation and correct anything I just said that might have been wrong. All right. So that being said, let's just kind of dive in here. So first off, the images that you see in this presentation are mine. I don't particularly refer to myself as like a professional macro photographer, or even kind of declare that as like my primary type of photography. The way that I approach macro is really, it's kind of my Zen style of photography. It's something that I do that doesn't require me to talk to people or really have a lot of plans for anything. I can just kind of grab my gear and go just about anywhere and find some sort of interesting subject. If you get close enough, pretty much everything looks interesting. So if you have any questions, I did actually include information on most of the images in here that kind of says what camera, what lens, and what settings it was shot with. I know people like to see that. But of course, I do work for Fujifilm, so I like to start also with a little bit of information on the Fujifilm cameras, some kind of like necessary stuff. A lot of this applies even if you don't shoot with a Fujifilm camera, and that's okay. But you know, we're going to talk about focus. We're going to talk about really just a few different settings here to start things off that are going to set the ground or lay the groundwork for the rest of the things we're going to discuss. So what I have here with me is the X-T4, and I just have a 16 to 55 zoom lens on here, but I'm going to kind of point out a few things that I have highlighted here. So most of the Fujifilm cameras, if you haven't seen one in person, have a rather old school appearance to them, especially the XT line like this one. So we have printed, you know, shutter speed dial, aperture dial on the lens, and ISO dial off to the side. Each of those have a little red A. If you want the camera to set it for you, you set it to the red A. Otherwise, you set it to the number that's printed on the dial, and that's what you're shooting with. Something else that all of our cameras have in common, I'm going to refer to some of the settings that you can find in here quickly. So pretty much you can find anything by hitting menu and going through the different pages of the menu. But Fujifilm likes to give us quick and easy mechanical, tactile ways to access a lot of the things that we need to access quickly while we're in the middle of taking photographs. So this little Q button off to the side, that's on pretty much all of our cameras. Actually, I think all of our cameras. And that brings up a quick menu, and it's a customizable quick menu. So by default, it has a lot of different settings like color, highlight and shadow tones, film simulations, things like that. And a lot of those actually affect the JPEGs only, but they do also affect what you see on the screen. So it gives us that WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get, something that is unique to mirrorless cameras, but not necessarily unique to Fujifilm. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the terms I used in their film simulations and things like that later. As far as pointing out other things on the camera here, most of our cameras will have either one of two things, either a drive dial, which on the X-T4 is the dial that's underneath the original ISO dial that I pointed out on the top. There's actually two dials stacked on top of each other there. Or some of our smaller cameras will have a button that just says drive on it, and it will bring it up on the screen. And that basically allows you to select the different drive or shooting modes. So bracketing, continuous shooting, those sort of things will all be found under that list. We also have a pretty universal switch for going back and forth between our different types of focus. So we call this a focus mode selector. On the X-T4, it's on the front of the camera. A lot of people go looking for it in the menu and can't find it. And that's because it's right there. So regardless of where it is on your camera, it will have the same three letters next to it, S, C, and M. And so that's for single, continuous, and manual. Like I said, focus is something that we're definitely going to talk about today. So we'll get into what those are and when you might use them a little bit more later. Just general information as far as approaching our system. One of the other things that's important to keep in mind is stabilization. So when you're doing this sort of work, when you're working close up and detailed subjects, having stability one way or another is important. And so a tripod is ideal, a monopod also a very good idea. But you don't always have that stuff. And like I said, I like to approach this in a way that keeps it fun. So sometimes that means taking less gear. And does that mean that I sort of recognize that I might not be getting the absolute best quality possible in the entire world? Yeah, but I want to have fun with it. So I'm just going to take the camera and one lens and go out there and see what I can do. So when I'm doing that, I will at least pick a camera that has stabilization or a lens that has stabilization. So as I've noted here on the page, all of our zooms, with the exception of the 16 to 55, which happens to be what's on my camera now, have optical image stabilization, and that three-letter abbreviation will be denoted on the lens somewhere as OIS, so optical image stabilization. Most of our prime lenses do not have optical image stabilization, with the exception of one of the lenses that we'll also be focusing on today. So the 80mm macro does have OIS, and then our large telephoto, which we won't really be talking about today, the two XF 200mm. Okay, and then also real quick, just as far as on the camera, before we go into the more specifics of each of these things, AF spot choices or autofocus areas, as you might call them, basically is your way of telling the camera where to look for a subject. And Fujifilm, this is one of my favorite things about our cameras, is we give you a lot of different options. And there's really three different modes. There's a single point, which is just a single area where you're telling the camera, okay, look here and nowhere else. Zone, which is a larger area, good for moving subjects, or wide or tracking, which is really not going to be something we're going to talk about today, because in macro and close-up photography, you do need some precision. So speaking of which, this is a very good example. So I have kind of a quote here: achieving focus on the right part of your subject is always important, regardless of the type of subject that you have or the type of photography that you're doing. But in close-up photography, it's even more paramount to be precise on where you're focusing and tell the camera exactly where to focus. So for example, that little snail shell that's there, there's not a lot to give you a reference of what size it is. You can kind of see, if you saw the full 50 megapixel image, you could see the grains of dirt in the thing that it's resting on, but really it's about the size of the tip of this pen. It's very, very, very small. And we'll talk about a couple of different things that affect the depth of field, but just for this image specifically, you can see how shallow it is. Just a little bit of dirt that's right in front of it, completely out of focus, and the background also completely unrecognizable. If I had missed autofocus or missed focus on my subject in general, you would definitely know. It would basically ruin this type of image. So it's very, very important. So that's going to be really the first thing that we dive into on a deeper level. So we're going to start with autofocus. There are some settings in the camera that I think you should avoid and some settings that you should use. And again, this is not general, photography advice. This is really specific to close-up work or macro work. So first of all, one of the popular features in cameras today is face and eye detection. It's something that will basically ignore whatever type of focus you've told it to use, or whatever type of area you've told it to use, whether using that single, zone, or wide. If it finds a face, it's going to recognize that face and it's going to set the focus area to that face. Oh, guess what? We're not usually going to fit a face in a close-up photograph, at least not the whole thing, maybe an eye or some detailed part of a face, but in that case, face and eye detection is not really going to help you anyways, because it's not recognizable when you're that close. So long story short, you should turn that off. And the reason for that is it is a mathematic algorithm that is looking for something that can be recognized as a face and eyes. And guess what? Just like, people will share every once in a while, oh, that cloud looks like a face. Oh, that stain on the side of that building looks like a face. Well, there's things in the natural world that look like a face, even to our cameras. And so if it sees something like that, doesn't happen very often, but it will take control of the camera and move your focus to that area and kind of mess up the work that you've been doing. So I recommend just turning it off. Next, I want to focus a little bit more on that SC and M. So SC and M, single, continuous, and manual. And just kind of break those down for you a little bit. These are something that you'll find on every camera, every modern camera at least. So the first one, S, that means that every time you half press the shutter, the camera will find focus on whatever area you've told it to focus on. Usually it will give you some indicators to let it know that to let you know rather that it's found focus on the subject. So sometimes the box around the subject will turn green, or there's a little dot in the corner that will show up that's green. And also a lot of times by default, the cameras will beep at you, a little chirpy beep. And those are all things to let you know, okay, we found focus, go ahead and take your picture. It's gonna be sharp, you're good to go. The next one, C, continuous. It won't do most of those things. It certainly won't chirp, and it doesn't lock onto a subject. Continuous is exactly what it sounds like. It's continuously focusing. So it's great for moving subjects. A lot of times you'll see sports photographers using it, but in this scenario, sometimes we'll have subjects that move too. Even if it's something that's, not like an animal, but maybe a flower that's just blowing in the wind. And so you can either shoot a lot of photos and just kind of capture one in focus as it's moving through your plane of focus, or you could try continuous focus and have it try to, track with that subject as it moves in the wind. And then the last one is manual. So M is for manual focus, and that means that you are going to be responsible for focusing manually using the manual focus ring on the lens. Each one of our lenses has one. I don't use them very much because the camera is faster and more accurate than I am in most situations. However, macro is one of the few times that I do actually use manual focus to be as precise as possible And Fujifilm does a great job of giving us tools to make sure that we can be successful. So we're going to dive into those in just a minute. Another warning for you on top of the face and eye detection warning, there's something in the menu called pre-AF. And what pre-AF does is it basically puts the camera into continuous autofocus, kind of as long as it's on. It's just trying to focus on what's in front of it. And the idea is it will be in focus whenever you do actually, lift it up to your face to kind of get ready to take a picture. Instead of being really far out of focus, if it's focusing on what's in front of it, ideally it'll be pretty close to in focus and you'll get to that shot faster. I found that there are very few use cases for that where it's actually, necessary. In most cases, especially in macro and things like that, your subject's not really going anywhere, and that mode is not really necessary. It puts a drain on your battery because the lens is sitting there focusing all the time. It's also probably just not good for your autofocus motor to have it just running all the time. So I recommend leaving that off, except for maybe those few cases that you think you might want to try it, turn it on, use it, and then turn it back off. There are, so in our contrast detection autofocus GFX models, so that would be the GFX 50S, the original one, the 50S2, which is the newest one, and then the 50R, the rangefinder style model. Those have another option in the menu called Rapid AF. And what that actually does is it draws a little bit of processing power from, I believe, the viewfinder to actually double the sampling rate of the autofocus system. So what that means is it's going to be checking for autofocus more frequently. So as it moves the focus through the frame, instead of checking, let's say 60 times a second, it's going to check 120 times per second. So that's going to help reduce hunting in contrast detection cameras. And that's kind of the goal there. So that could be something that would be useful if you were in low light or had low contrast, kind of like that snail shell was kind of under shade. So there's not a lot of contrast there. The rest of our cameras are phase and contrast detection. So you won't see this option in the menu. Rapid AF is only in those three models to my knowledge. Okay, so as far as areas go, I want to talk about that a little bit more. So the area is the box on your screen that you can move around and tell it where to focus, right? So the box that shows up on the screen, normally you'll have this little joystick on the back, as I like to call it, or as the manual calls it, a focus lever. Maybe joystick is trademarked, but so it's this little thing right here. And so if we just kind of push it left, right, up, and down, you'll see that box move around the screen. Whatever the box is on is what the camera is going to focus on. So in the menu, under the autofocus manual focus section, there's the AF mode section. And so that's where we can go to change from single point to zone and wide slash tracking. On our newer models, there's also an option called all. And all is actually just a way that you can quickly access the other three that I mentioned without going into the menu. So that's what I keep mine set to, because I like to spend as much time taking pictures and as little time in the menu as possible. So when I have it set to all, which I do now, I can just press that focus lever straight in, and it brings me to a screen where it kind of gets rid of all the numbers and stuff around the outside. And it highlights my focus area in green, has little arrows around it. So at that point, I can roll my rear dial and I can actually change the size of it. And so even if I'm in single point, for instance, I can change the size of my single point. The camera's going to treat a single point like a single point no matter what. So that means, like I said, it's going to ignore everything outside of that box. It will only look there. It doesn't really matter what's going on anywhere else. And for macro, that's usually the best type of autofocus, to choose a single point and ideally make it as small as possible so you can be as precise as possible and put it right where you want that maximum peak focus. If it's one of those scenarios like the flower moving, or maybe even it is a living subject like a bug or a lizard or something like that that you're trying to get close to, that might be moving. So you could make that focus area a little bit bigger by rolling this back dial, still having it be a single point. It's just a larger single point that gives you a little bit more flexibility to place it on that subject. If you have it too small on a moving subject, then it kind of goes to the background for a second, then it might focus on the background, and then trying to get it back to the subject can be a challenge. So that's why you might make it larger. But otherwise, if it's a non-moving subject, really make it as small as possible, be as precise as possible, and you'll get the best results. If you keep rolling that dial, since I've selected in all, if I keep rolling, it goes up to zone. It actually tells me at the top of the screen that I'm in zone autofocus area. And so there's 3 different sizes of zone. And again, depending on basically how much movement is in my subject, I might, use some of those zone autofocuses as well. But generally speaking, for detail-oriented photography, what we're talking about today, I'm going to keep it very small. I don't use zone very much, and I certainly don't use wide or tracking, because when I go to wide, that's basically me giving up complete and total control of the camera. When you do that, it does generally choose whatever the closest discernible subject is to the camera. And generally speaking, that's a good guess as to what you would want to focus on. But I've found that in macro photography, the less things you have on auto, the better. So selecting single point is kind of a good place to start. So this is my cat, Bruce. This was actually when the XE3 had just come out. And the first thing I did was put our smallest macro lens on it, the 60mm on, and just kind of see what kind of detail I could get. And, the small camera allowed me to work with my cat and, and basically shoot with one hand and kind of position him with the other. And one of the things I want to point out here is that the eyes of your subject are important. So I put that famous quote at the top: eyes are the window to your soul. And I think a lot of people remember that, or know that rather, whenever we're talking about portraits. You want to see the eyes of your portrait subject. But it's really important with animals as well, and even bugs. Unless you're really highlighting maybe some pattern on the wing of a butterfly or something like that. Generally speaking, if you're photographing the entire animal or the face, the eyes should be the part that is the sharpest. And so this is just kind of a photograph to give that as an example. All right, so still on focus. We're going to talk a little bit about manual focus, and then we're going to get into some of the tools that are necessary to create these images. And so that's, I think, probably the highlight of this, and I think it's certainly my favorite part. So we'll get into that. But manual focus first. So that would be, I'd start by going to the front of the camera, switching that focus mode selector that I talked about earlier to M. And I'm going to focus with this ring here. Now, normally, I can just see on the screen or through the viewfinder my subject, my entire frame, rather, my entire image. What I see here is what I'm going to capture. There's a couple of different things that I can do once I'm in manual focus. Like I said, Fujifilm gives us some tools basically to set us up for success, even when you're manually focusing. The first one is, well, autofocus, which sounds a little bit strange because we're in manual focus, but it's a really neat tool. So on the X-T4, there's actually a button that says AF on. And when we're in manual focus, it still does what it says on it. It turns AF on, turns autofocus on for just the moment while you're holding it. And even on some of our older cameras like the X-T3, the previous model to this one, it doesn't have an AF on button, but it does have an AFL button. And the AFL button by default is to lock autofocus. So if we're in manual focus, there's no autofocus to lock. The AFL button would actually just be a button that doesn't do anything. So Fujifilm kind of gave it a second purpose. And when we're in manual focus, you can actually hit the AFL button to turn on autofocus temporarily as well. And the reason that's useful is because I can be in manual focus, making my adjustments here, but maybe I want to switch subjects from a flower that's, kind of a little farther away to maybe one a little bit closer. And instead of sitting here racking my focus to get from out here to in here, I can just point at my subject, hit that AF on button or the AFL button, let the autofocus do most of the moving for me. Instead of just sitting here cranking this thing all the way around, I'll let it kind of use the motor to zip to, my subject. And maybe it doesn't nail it, but then the moment I let go of that AFL or AF on button, it goes back to normal manual focus, and I can tweak with my manual focus ring again. And so it's a really good tool to help you move from subject to subject quickly. And so I like that a lot. One of the other ones is focus check. And this one is a little bit tricky because there's two different ways to use it. If you go into the menu and you see the option focus check, like it shows on the screen here, I actually leave that off. However, I do use focus check all the time. Let me explain. So if you turn on focus check in the menu, the way that it behaves is anytime you start to turn the manual focus ring, it zooms in and magnifies the area that you have the focus box set to. And the magnification, so your frame is still the entire shot, but it's taking that small part and blowing up to the entire screen so that you can really see with a lot of detail whether you're in focus or not. It can be useful, but having it do that anytime you touch the manual focus ring makes it difficult to frame your shot. And oftentimes it's just kind of unnecessary. It can be a little jarring as well. So separating those two tasks, framing the shot and focusing, can basically alleviate that. So the way that we do that is by default, most of the cameras that have this, modern cameras that have this dial on the back, we call it a command dial. That's the same dial I was talking about in the AF mode screen that would change the size, or you could even use it for shutter speed or anything like that. But in this case, it's also a button. So we can use this dial for a lot of different things. But when I'm in my normal screen for taking pictures, if I push it straight in like a button, it will actually zoom in to the image and enable focus check. And then once it makes that initial zoom in, depending on the camera, so like our GFX models, you actually get like 4 different amounts of magnification. I think on most of the X series models, you get 2, but you can either have it like kind of magnified a lot or a little for differing amounts of precision. So that's another good tool for us there. We also have under the menu several different things that are called manual focus assist modes. So under MF assist, under the AF/MF section of the menu, there's a few different options. So there's peaking. Peaking is probably the most popular option. And what that is it basically just puts an artificial kind of highlight around the subject that's in focus. And the really cool thing about that is it's not just at peak focus. It'll have maybe more of it at the part where it's the sharpest. Peak focus is what I'm referring to there. So the sharpest part of the image. But it also acts as a pretty good like live depth of field preview, because you can see how much of your image is highlighted, and anything that's going to have that highlight around it is going to be in focus, or at least relatively in focus. The magnified view or focus check is kind of those are the same thing there that I was talking about. I just refer to them a little bit differently. And then we have 2 that are based on the focusing methods for old film cameras. One is split focus, which is basically 4 big sections of the image that are cut out. And as you focus on a subject, it will align. So originally it would be split apart. And as it lines up, if you've ever used a film camera that had that, you can imagine what I'm talking about. It's just a digital version of that. And as it lines up, then it becomes clear and it lines up correctly. So microprism is kind of a similar idea, except instead of 4 big chunks, it's kind of a circle with a bunch of smaller squares on it. And they split apart. Anything that's split apart and doesn't look like it's supposed to is going to be out of focus. Anything that is lined up and looks like it does in real life is going to be in focus. And there's even, so like on the microprism and split focus, you can go in and have that area be in color or black and white so that you can make it a little bit easier to discern from the background, even an additional level to each of those. And then on the bottom right, that screen there is for peaking. So in peaking, you can choose different colors and different amounts of that highlight that I was talking about. So that, if you were photographing a red subject and you used the red autofocus peaking, it would be kind of hard to discern where that highlight is. So you would choose something, a differing color, white or blue. And then lower high is just going to be more or less of that that highlighty stuff around the edges. It's a technical term, highlighty stuff.
No, not at all, Matt.
Yep. So how are we doing? I see you're getting a lot of questions there. I hope that
So far, so good.
Okay, good. Anything that I need to cover, you think, or have you?
The only thing I can think of is dual display is a great option for manual focus.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So basically, when we're in manual focus, so again, as long as the camera on the front is set to M, we can use this button on the back here, the display, to alter through the different types of displays that we can have on the screen. And so when you're in manual focus, there's an extra one. So normally in autofocus, there's 3. It's either like all, I can plug this in if I want. Sure, that's a good point, and I don't have a slide for it. So I'm gonna plug in the camera real quick so that you guys can actually see what Christopher is talking about here. So, stop this, and we'll add. All right. So there's a couple of different modes. And so the normal one would be something like this, where you see, your information, your settings, your focus area and everything around the outside. And it just kind of takes up the entire screen. If I hit that display back button again, it gets rid of all my numbers and just kind of shows my image. If I hit it one more time, it's going to bring me to this screen. And so those 3 that I just showed you are available in autofocus or manual focus. The dual display is the one that Christopher was referring to, and it's this screen. So you can see that the image on the right is basically just a magnified image of where my focus is. So as I move my focus area around, that image on the right will show me just kind of a continuous magnified view of my subject. So I can see better in that little image on the right if it's in focus or not.
Matt, can you reduce the size of the area just to show them?
Sure. So yeah, so while this is actually a good example, so we can go in and see on the screen what I was talking about earlier. What I did there is I clicked in that focus lever. So the same thing that I used to turn, push left, right, up, and down to move it around. Pushing it straight in brings me to this screen, and I can make my focus area smaller so I can be even more precise, right? So I can put it maybe right on my inner button there. And so then my screen on the right-hand side becomes even closer, and it gives me an even better option or opportunity to check focus. You can see it's out of focus and in focus. One of the other things that's pretty neat here is if I go in and use some of my autofocus assist options. So let's say I want to use peaking, and I'll do red. I usually like red. So I can see it on the side there. So that's even another layer, and I can use multiples of these tools. So you can see as it goes out of focus, the red disappears. It comes into focus, the red comes back. And high is a very obvious look to it. So hopefully that demonstration helps you guys understand some of the topics we just talked about. Christopher, thank you very much for bringing that to my attention. And you guys keep the questions coming. Christopher is an expert and is also a fast typer. So keep him coming, keep him working. All right, let me get
Thanks,
back
Matt. I
to,
appreciate that.
yep. What, hey, yeah, there was a small compliment in there. All right, let me get back to my presentation here. All right. So another little image, I like to put image breaks in here, and I also just like to point out certain things about images that I think are useful. So using depth of field, again, a lot of people have experience taking pictures of people, so they're used to that shallow depth of field look. I mean, there's even on cell phones, there's a fake shallow depth of field for a portrait mode, right? They just fake that blurry out of focus background, which probably drives most of us photographers crazy, but it's there and people like it. So apply that to really any situation where it can help do what it's supposed to do, which is emphasize your subject. Bring your viewers' attention to the part of the image that you want them to focus on. So using shallow depth of field, in this case here, having even the leaf that the little fly is on out of focus, closer to the subject, or closer to the viewer rather, and then having that nice out of focus background, really just helps us know exactly what we're supposed to look at, and helps to elevate the image as a whole. Right. So we mentioned just quickly a few times here that AF joystick, as I like to call it, or the focus lever, as the manual likes to call it. It's that little joystick on the back. So that can be locked. Just a quick tip here. If anybody has an issue with kind of accidentally bumping it, especially on some of the smaller cameras, if you have bigger hands, you do what I call fat fingering it, affectionate term, and you end up accidentally moving your focus around. So there's a shortcut to it. You can hold that focus lever or joystick straight in, and you can hold it there for 5 seconds, and it will bring up the screen on the lower right of the presentation right now, where you have the options for on, which is what it comes set to by default. That middle with the circle and the different directional buttons, or different directions pointing out from it, means that you have to click it straight in, and then you can move it around. Or off means it does absolutely nothing. This can also be found just like every other setting. Fujifilm likes to give us shortcuts, but if you don't remember the shortcut, like holding that joystick in for 5 seconds, you can always find it in the menu. And things like this are usually going to live under that button and dial settings, which is down under the wrench. In case you can't tell, we focus on focus a lot when it comes to close-up photography, because it's the most important part of close-up photography. So that's what most of the tips are going to be on here. So we're getting into that part of the presentation where we're going to talk about gear. We're going to talk about the tools necessary to do this type of photography. So first, we're going to talk about how to get close enough. So there are some different options. So the first and probably most well-known option is a macro lens. And the reason that a macro lens is different from a normal lens is just basically focus. It will focus closer to the camera than a normal lens of its same focal length would. So, for instance, the one in the image there is our most popular macro lens, is the 80 millimeter. And that at 80 millimeters will focus all the way down to 9.84 inches. So that is the minimum focusing distance of this lens. And if you look at spec sheets for our lenses, no matter what type of lens it is, it will tell you what the minimum focusing distance is. So as we look at different macro lenses, we also have a 60 millimeter. So I'll hold these side by side so you can see the size difference here. The 60 millimeter is a lot smaller, also a macro lens, but it's not quite the same magnitude of macro lens. So the way that you can judge how close a macro lens can get you is the reproduction ratio. So that's something else that's usually not printed on the lens, but it is something that, at least for macro lenses, is disclosed. And so it will look basically like a fraction, but it will have a colon in the middle instead of that little slashy line that a fraction has. And it should be thought of as in the same way. So for instance, 1 to 1 is how you would say it, but it would be 1:1 is what the 80 millimeter is able to achieve. So that is referred to by a few different terms as well, like true macro or life size macro lens, life size reproduction. And what that really means is that the image that that lens is going to project onto our image sensor is the exact same size as the subject is in real life. So if you picked up that, that bumblebee and set it on your sensor, that is 1:1 reproduction ratio. Now, of course, we don't view images the size of our image sensor. We view them much larger. So when you view that image larger than the size of the sensor, that's where the larger than life aspect of macro comes from. But other options exist as well. So like the smaller, lighter, less expensive 60 millimeter is a 1:2 aspect ratio, or a reproduction ratio rather. And so what that means, as you can imagine, since like what I said earlier, treat it like a fraction, 1:2 is half. So it's basically half of life size. So it's not quite as close. It also works the other way. So we don't make a lens that natively does it, but there are, I think, is it Laowa? Christopher, you can chime in there in chat, or
Yep,
maybe
you're
share a
right.
link even. Laowa
Zeiss also makes one,
Yep.
50 millimeter. Rokinon, they make a few that are just strict manual focus.
Right. So some of those are, macro lenses definitely, but I was referring to the ones that go beyond 1:1 reproduction ratio. So I know Canon
Just
makes
Laowa,
one,
my apologies.
and then Laowa, so they'll go where the larger number comes first. So for instance, the macro lens that Canon has made for a long time, it's full manual focus. So if you wanted to adapt it to a Fujifilm camera, you could very easily, because it doesn't even have to have autofocus adapter or any, it would be a relatively inexpensive adapter, probably $20-$30, something like that. So when that number comes, the larger number comes first, 5:1, that means it's 500% or 5 times larger than real life projected onto the image sensor, which means we're getting a very, very, very close image. We'll get into some of the details of what that really means when you get that close, and how that can affect the other aspects of your image in just a little bit. But first, I want to talk about some other tools that allow you to get close. So extension tubes. This is another very good, this is probably the best option, actually, in my mind, short of buying a true macro lens. And even if you were to get a macro lens, extension tubes can actually work with your macro lens. And so you just have to get the one that's made for your camera, and made for your lens rather. Well, I guess your camera and your lens technically. But what an extension tube is, and so this is one for our X series. This is the MCEX16. We also have a smaller, thinner one, MCEX11. So these are extension tubes. They are just tubes that extend the lens farther away from the camera. And when that happens, it basically takes what we would call the working distance of the lens and moves it closer. So moving the lens farther away takes the working distance closer to the camera, which means you can get closer to your subject. So the only drawback to doing this is it doesn't just move the close focus capabilities. So like macro lenses allow you to get closer to your subject than a normal lens would. Extension tubes would allow you to do that with a normal lens, right? So if you're with me, I could take something like, say, this 90 millimeter, which is typically a portrait lens. It doesn't focus very close at all. That, for instance, the focal lengths are very similar. Maybe Christopher can find the minimum focus distance for the 90 millimeter. I don't know it off the top of my head, but if I had to guess, I'd say like 3 feet-ish. So
I'm
the 80
disappointed in
millimeter,
you.
hey, you know what? I only have so much capacity up here. So 9.84 inches on the 80 millimeter and guesstimating somewhere around 2-3 feet for the 90 millimeter means that I'm going to get a lot closer image, a lot larger, more detailed image of my subject with this lens because I can get closer to it. So I add this extension tube to it and I can actually get closer to my subject again. But since it's moving my entire working distance, it's also affecting the infinity side of my lens's capability to focus. So that means if I tried to take a picture of the sunset while I had an extension tube on, it would be completely out of focus. And one of the benefits and drawbacks of extension tubes is they can actually be used together. So I could take, the thinner one, the MCEX11 and the MCEX16, stack them together, and then attach my lens to it. And basically, the more that I extend my lens away from my camera, the closer I can focus. But that's going to take the other end and move it closer and closer as well. So if I do something like this combination, and I try to focus on maybe a butterfly comes and lands a mere 6 to 8 feet away from me, I might not be able to focus on it anymore because I've shifted my entire working distance so close to the camera that I can't take a normal picture anymore. So just something to be aware of. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just if you're going to work with these tools, you should know kind of the entirety of how they affect your ability to take a picture. And then the last thing that I have on this screen is a teleconverter. And so again, we make two of them. There's a 1.4x teleconverter and a 2x teleconverter for the X series. And we actually have another one for GF that is a 1.4x teleconverter. There's no 2x for the GF lens. But what these are is they might look sort of similar, but where the extension tubes are exactly that, they're just tubes, they're hollow tubes. Like here's one for the GF lineup. So I could stick my finger through here. There's nothing in there. It has contacts so that I still have image stabilization and autofocus, but there's no lens element to this. There's no glass. Teleconverters do have glass in them. So there's a few glass elements in here that basically multiply the focal length of my lens. So they magnify my image essentially. So by 1.4x in the case of the 1.4x TC, so it takes if I had a 100 millimeter lens for easy math and it multiplies it, makes it a 140 millimeter lens. So effectively giving me a tighter field of view, bringing my subject closer to me, right? The 2x teleconverter would basically double your focal length. So it would turn a 100 millimeter into a 200 millimeter. And a lot of times these teleconverters are used for subjects that are far away. People wanting to photograph, wild animals on a safari. They can't get that close to the lion. So they put this sort of thing on there and allows them to bring that lion closer to them. But one of the things that I really like about our 80 millimeter macro is pretty unique about this macro lens in particular is that it can accept our teleconverters. So I can add these in and I can actually use combinations of extension tubes and teleconverters to get, some varying amounts of closeness. The nice thing about teleconverters is they do not affect the working distance of your lens. So extension tubes bring everything closer. I can put a teleconverter on there and still focus to infinity, or whatever's far away from me. And I can still focus very, very close. So those are basically everything there. Those are all Fujifilm products. They're specific to the camera and lens that you would use. So if you don't have a Fujifilm camera or lens, you would look for these products that fit your camera or lens. These are some other options. So starting on the top left, there's something called a reverse lens mounting ring or adapter. And it's basically, it threads on the front of the lens like a filter. And then the other side of that, it's just a ring so the other side of it will have the bayonet mount that would normally be on the back of the lens to attach to the front of your camera. And it allows you to flip the lens around and mount it backwards. which basically inverts the working distance of the lens. And instead of focusing from a normal distance, say 3 feet to infinity, it now will focus basically only very, very close to the camera. That can work pretty well, but the problem is most modern lenses use focus by wire. They have image stabilization, and even the aperture control. So the amount of light coming in through the lens is controlled electronically through a connection to the camera. So this method works pretty well with old school lenses. If you can get something older, like the one that's in the picture is, I think, an old Nikon lens, if I had to guess, that has mechanical aperture control on the lens itself, so that you can still control your aperture. Something to be aware of there. But that obviously is a relatively inexpensive way to test out close-up photography or see if you're even interested in doing macro. One of the other things that you can try are magnifying filters. So this is something that goes in front of your existing lens. You can have some varying results here. There's definitely different quality levels of, these are basically magnifying glasses that thread onto the front of the lens. I've seen good results and I've seen bad results. I don't know that I really have a strong enough background in using those to give a recommendation of a specific product. Fujifilm doesn't make any of them. So look for somebody else's reviews on those, but it is a tool that's out there and available. And then the other one here is bellows. So these bellows that are in the image on the lower left basically are an adjustable extension tube. And so it works just like the extension tube. You mount the lens to the front, you mount the back to the camera, and you can adjust how far that lens is pushed away from the camera. There's other tools out there as well, but those are a good synopsis, I think, of what you guys might be looking for. So the next kind of question that I think we should ask ourselves when we're trying to get close up and get close to subjects is, well, how close is close enough? So we talked about how to get close, and now we want to talk about maybe how to back up a little bit. And the reason I use this image is this is an image that I am not particularly proud of. I thought it was pretty cool. I took a lot of pictures of these bugs. They were zipping around the top of the water. And so that's why they have that little reflection, sort of metallic looking thing. They're actually set on the top of the water. They're quite small, and they did not hold still at all. So it was kind of challenging. I got this frame that had 2 bugs in it, and the one in the front is actually quite sharp. But as I mentioned earlier, I think that when you have even an insect's face or eyes visible, then without a really compelling reason, which I don't think this image has one, really the eyes or the face of the animal should be the sharpest part. And in this, it's not. It's kind of that mid-thorax, right where those legs attached to the back, which there's some neat detail there and something I certainly wouldn't have seen with the naked eye. So I still enjoy the image, but it's a bit of a miss by my standards. And so part of the thing here is, again, I mentioned that these are very, very small insects. I was very, very close to capture this image. And the closer you get, the shallower your effective depth of field becomes. So if you're working right on top of your subject, if you're shooting with the same settings, so let's just say, I take this 60mm lens that I have, and I shoot it wide open at 2.4, and I take a portrait headshot, maybe from 4 or 5 feet away, then, I might have a pretty decent depth of field. At 2.4, I'm probably going to have some shallow depth of field effects. Background will be out of focus, but it'll probably cover the face of that person. If I do the same thing and I get as close as this lens, since it's a macro lens, is capable of getting, I'm going to be very close to my subject, and my depth of field becomes very, very shallow, like you see in this subject, or in this image, where a very small insect, only a portion of it is in focus. So something to keep in mind, and we'll talk a little bit about why that happens in just a minute. But on that note, sometimes you can actually get close enough without a macro lens or really any other special tools. So these are 3 lenses in particular, and I did list out the minimum focusing distance for these because I think it's relevant. So the 100 to 400, again, a setup that's typically thought of for, distant subjects. The minimum focusing distance of this lens, even at 400 millimeters, is 68.9 inches, which sounds like a lot compared to the 8.9 inches I told you on the macro lens. But we're at 400 millimeters instead of 80. So that means I can actually still get a close-up image. And it's why I kind of refer to this type of work as close-up photography instead of macro photography, because it's not necessarily all macro. But I still just want a close-up detailed image of a subject. And that can be a really powerful tool for, I don't know if you guys noticed a little while ago, I kind of didn't talk much about the subject, but there was a close-up shot of a crocodile's eye. Well, guess what? I wasn't 2 inches away from the front of that crocodile because it was alive. So I used a longer lens and kind of kept my distance. So sometimes that's the right tool for the job. The 18 to 135 on the right side is one of the other ones that I like to use. It's a great travel lens. So it's something that you can kind of have with you all the time. Even when you're traveling, kind of traveling light, just one camera, one lens, still allows you to capture some close-up macro images. So this was taken in Puerto Vallarta. We went to a Botanic Gardens I wasn't planning on going to. I didn't have any macro equipment with me, but it's where I kind of discovered that 17.72 inches, which is the minimum focusing distance of this lens at 135 millimeters, allows me to capture images like this, really quite close up, really kind of everything that I would have needed from this situation anyways. And this is straight out of camera. So something to keep in mind. Just test the minimum focusing distance of the lenses you have. You might be surprised of what you can capture. So on the other side of things, so this is just pulled straight from, it's like a little slide that I made, pulled straight from my Instagram, which you can see there. I'll also share it at the end if you guys want to reach out to me afterwards, if you have any questions that we don't get to. But this is actually the 18 to 135. So my wife and I were taking pictures of these little frogs outside of the hotel. This is my wife taking pictures. I'm holding a flashlight to kind of illuminate the subject a little bit. 18 to 135 zoomed in all the way, about 17 or so inches away. And this is basically what we got, just cropped into a square for Instagram. So that's what that looks like. Pretty darn good. Lots of detail. You can see the texture in the skin. Pretty stinking cool. I wanted to get closer. So I ran inside, and this time I did have access to an 80 millimeter macro. And that allowed me to get this image, again, just cropped into a square. But really, that's basically, that's the image. So quite a bit closer than I was able to get without, with the 18-135. So real macro lens makes a little bit of a difference. And then this here is just a cropped in image to kind of create the look that I was really wanting to get, and to really show just kind of an example of what that lens and camera system is capable of, the amount of detail that you're really capturing. So this is just a cropped in portion of this shot. So, lots of fun. And as you saw, it was just created with a little pocket flashlight that I keep in my pocket all the time. So nothing special there. The important thing there as far as lights go is to have a light source that is not attached to the top of your camera. Because if it's attached to the top of the camera, a lot of times when you're that close, you get a shadow from the lens, and that can ruin things. So have a light that you can hold off to the side. I brought this as well. So this is just an LED light that you could hold up to the front so that you're not getting a shadow from either yourself or your equipment. All right, we're going to get nerdy again for a second, but I think it's relevant. So these are a couple of things pulled from the manual of the 80 millimeter, but these are things that apply to more lenses than just the 80. You would see these on most macro lenses and even some telephoto lenses. So the focus range selector on the left is a switch that's on the side of the lens. And this is another tool to kind of set yourself up for success. If you look at it, there are three options. The first one is full, which means it focuses from its minimum focusing distance, 0.25 meters, out to infinity. So that's the entire range. The other two options limit that to a certain section. So the middle one is 0.5 meters to infinity. And so that would be good if I wanted to basically use this 80 millimeter as a portrait lens or something like that. Use it to take a normal photo, if you will. And so that will help to eliminate a section of the focus range, which will help it to focus faster. That's why we would do this. And then the last one here, 0.25 to 0.5 meters. So just the close stuff. So I can do the whole thing. I can do just the stuff that's farther away, or I can just do just the stuff that's close up. The only thing I will warn you about here is remember that you switched it, because if you go to take something close up and then you try to focus on something far away and you have that switch on still, well, guess what? It's just not going to do it because you told it not to. So one of the other things that I pulled out of the manual here, and it is something that I've sort of referenced a few times, but there's another aspect here that we hadn't talked about yet. So focusing close does a couple of different things to your image. So at the top of this little chart that we have here, reproduction ratio is what we talked about when we were talking about the different lenses, you know, and what they're capable of. This in this case, the 80 millimeter is a 1-to-1, so we can go all the way to life size. And any of these would be basically just focusing on a subject from a farther distance. So maybe we're 1 to 1.5, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, or 1 to 5. And right underneath, it shows the distance that we are away from our subject, right? So as we get farther away, our reproduction ratio changes. Makes sense. Now, the bottom two lines are the part that are a little bit interesting and surprise some people. So our effective F number, or the effective amount of light that we're able to gather when we focus closer, changes. And it's because of how much the autofocus, or the focusing parts of the lens have to move. You can't gather the same amount of light as you can when they're in a different position. So as we get closer, you can see our effective F number, or our exposure factor, which is another way of just kind of phrasing the same essential idea. So we're getting less light. We go from effective 3.1. By the way, the 80 millimeters is 2.8. So if I go out beyond, 0.54 meters some point, I can get it down to 2.8. But once I start getting closer, it goes up to 3.1, then 3.2, 3.4, 3.6. And eventually, when I'm as close as I can possibly get with this lens, it's no longer a 2.8 lens. It's a maximum of f4 as far as light gathering capability goes. So that's something to keep in mind. It's another reason to get a light source. So we talked about the closer we get, the shallower our depth of field becomes. It can be tricky to keep an entire subject in focus, but also the closer we get, maybe the less light we're getting. So that's two very compelling reasons to get a light to do close-up photography. Another little tip here, just keep shooting. This is probably, I don't typically encourage people to just take a bunch of pictures without really thinking about it. But when you find a shot that you want, take a lot, because whenever you're doing something that requires this much detail, it's hard to tell. Even with the autofocus and manual focus options that we have, and as advanced as this technology is, and all of these assists that we have, it's still just hard to tell until you pull it up on the big screen in your editing program and really look and see how much detail you have. So for instance, this is just, I don't even think this is all of them, but I shot basically this one flower and this bee buzzing around it, I don't know, maybe 50 pictures of the same thing to get the one that I like, where the edge of the flower is in focus, the bee is in focus. I have a slightly slow enough shutter speed to where I can see some movement in the wings, but really everything else is tack sharp. This is one of those images I want to point out is captured with that 90 millimeter. This is actually taken with the X-T2, so it was before the 80 millimeter existed. And I had to get a little creative on how to get these close-up photographs. The 90 millimeter, which like I said earlier, is like typically a portrait lens, is one of the sharpest lenses I've ever used. And with, when combined with extension tubes, it makes a very, very good macro lens. So don't overlook those options. So I want to talk a little bit about getting an image that you're proud of straight out of the camera. So kind of wrapping things up and getting something that you're happy to show people. Fujifilm also gives us a couple of different options here. So film simulations. And we do have 6 different types of bracketing, which we obviously don't have time to go over. But film simulations are different, basically color profiles, looks, appearances of color that are built into our cameras. Each one of our cameras, our X series cameras and GFX cameras have them. And they're based on like 100 years of color science. Fujifilm has been making film for longer than, well, I would think probably anybody on this call has been alive. And so they apply that color science to each of these films, and then those films to these film simulations. So it's not just created or sort of made up looks. Like you can get filters all over the internet and all sorts of apps with all sorts of presets and things like that. These are a little more well thought out than that. And they're worth using, they're worth looking at. It's actually where I start most of my editing as well. Even if I shoot in RAW, the film simulation is not by default going to be on there, but I can start by applying one of the film simulations that's baked into that RAW file. So one of the types of bracketing that I brought up there, we have 6 of them, but one of them is film simulation bracketing. So I can actually take one picture and get 3 images. It will save 3 JPEGs. And if I'm shooting JPEG and RAW, it will actually save 4 files, 3 JPEGs and 1 RAW with whatever 3 film simulations I choose. So in this particular case, you can see I took this picture of it. I believe it's a dahlia. I'm no botanist, but correct me if I'm wrong there. And so I kind of thought Velvia. I kind of thought, okay, I really want really vibrant, rich colors. But as you can see in the top left, that image there is taken with Velvia, and it's almost too much for this flower. It's kind of overwhelming. A lot of times I include a black and white image since I can't see in black and white. I like to use film simulation bracketing to show me what black and white might look like. And sometimes it surprises me. I don't really get to think about it, so I like to see it. And then this last one here is classic chrome. It's the one in the front. It's the one that I like. I basically go, okay, cool. That one looks great. I set it to classic chrome and I went on about, photographing some of the flowers. This one happens to be a different flower. Found one with some little buds and a leaf and things that were just positioned as so to kind of make a good composition. Didn't have a bunch of stuff very close to it, so I could use that depth of field to really isolate my subject. I just kind of worked with my composition a little bit, worked with my color. And this is straight out of camera. When you put that thought into the image, you don't need to spend 2 hours behind a computer editing that picture before you show it to anybody. I sat down for lunch after my time here with the flower and transferred it over to my cell phone and shared it with the world. It's that instant gratification that everybody longs for. And this is, these cameras give you a way to do that. So just make use of it. Quick reminder also for any of my Fujifilm users, keep your firmware updated. We put out firmware all the time. We give you free upgrades. It's really what it amounts to. There's new film simulations. There's better autofocus. There's all sorts of different things that get added to these cameras. If you have a camera that you've had for a couple of years and you haven't updated it, you're doing yourself a disservice. Go to fujifilmfirmware.com or just go to our Fujifilm-X website and look for the firmware section under the support page. That's me on Instagram. I said I'd leave it again. I'll actually put it in the chat as well, but I'm going to go ahead and shrink down here. I don't think I went over by too much, less than 10 minutes, not too bad. If anybody has any questions, I am not in a huge hurry, so make sure that I'm not just finishing up and running away here. Christopher, and I want to invite Julie back as well from National Camera. How are things going?
Well, we appreciate it, Matt.
That was an excellent presentation. And I would
Thank
just
you.
like to say from National Camera that this is close-up month for us. And we do have many accessories available on sale, including macro sliders, filters, and tripods on sale through our website as well as through our store. And of course, check back to National Camera to see what other webinars we have coming up. And thank you so much, Matthew and Christopher. We just appreciate Fujifilm so much.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much for hosting us, Julie. I had fun. I won't speak for anyone else, but that's one of my favorite things to talk about. And I think that's why Christopher had me do it. And I want to thank also Christopher for inviting me into what typically would be your store. And it's good talking. talking with everybody tonight.
Well, definitely appreciate it, Matt. So another thing we wanted to add in there, I don't know if you've gone over the Tech Time one-on-one. That's a good addition. If you have any questions or you want further explanation of items that revolve around our products, if you go to our website under support, there's free Tech Time one-on-one. It's a 30-minute consultation with us, one of the techs. There's 4 of us over the US, and we can talk about whatever you want. The weather. I've had people try to do a job interview before, but it's a great resource that costs absolutely nothing. And so we have a lot of people that sign up and repeatedly sign up. And if you don't abuse it, you're welcome to use it as much as you'd like. If you need help, if you need another lens selection choice, if you need help with your camera as far as certain functions, or it's acting a little funky, it's just free to you, because ultimately we're here to help you out. And Julie, I just want to say thank you for allowing us to be here. Just want to echo what Matthew said. We definitely appreciate being a part of National Camera Exchange and what they have to offer. And I know hopefully soon I'll be able to be there in real life person, because that's really where I excel. And Matthew is a lot better looking in person, because his face isn't as magnified. He's using a macro lens right now. No, we give each other a hard time all the time. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for being a part of this, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Have a good evening.